Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace from my atheist perspective. In this video, we're going to cover chapters 3 and 4 of the book, so let's get started right away with chapter 3, which is titled Principle Number 3, Learn to Think Circumstantially. This chapter's opening anecdote is about a cold case that Wallace worked where the only piece of physical evidence they could recover from the crime scene was a bit of hair left behind, presumably by the murderer. Using a DNA marker extracted from the hair, Wallace and his fellow detectives were able to rule out all of their potential suspects, but they were unable to identify the actual killer. Wallace laments his lack of success over the years using DNA evidence, claiming that it has never helped him to close a cold case. Instead, he's had much more success on cases with little or no forensic evidence, but with lots of circumstantial evidence. Could this be why he was so drawn to the case of Jesus? Though I think that case lacks even circumstantial evidence, but we're going to get there eventually. Let me not get ahead of myself. Wallace explains the difference between direct and indirect evidence. Indirect evidence also sometimes being called circumstantial evidence. He uses the examples of a reliable witness testifying that they saw it raining outside. That would be direct evidence. And a reliable witness testifying that they saw someone enter the building wearing a wet raincoat, which would be indirect evidence. The testimony of the second witness doesn't prove that it's raining outside all by itself, but it supports the conclusion that it was raining outside, and the more circumstantial evidence supporting that same conclusion that can be collected, the more reasonable it becomes to ultimately conclude that it was, in fact, raining outside. Given the nature of the case, as Wallace calls it, being considered in this book, I find it interesting that Wallace would choose to use different types of witness testimony to illustrate direct and indirect evidence rather than examples of direct and indirect forensic evidence, which would have actually been more consistent with the anecdote he shares to begin the chapter. DNA evidence, as I'm sure Wallace knows, isn't necessarily direct evidence. In many, if not most cases, the most that DNA evidence can do is establish that a particular person was at a particular location, not unlike fingerprints. The reason I suspect why Wallace chose to use witness testimony to illustrate the difference between direct and indirect evidence is that there is no direct forensic evidence in the Jesus case. There's no forensic evidence of any kind. His aim is to close this case in the minds of his readers, to convince us that Jesus was the Son of God and that he rose from the grave after dying on the cross. He can't do that using forensic evidence. There isn't any. So instead, he explains the concept of circumstantial evidence using witness testimony and assures us, quote, "Most people tend to think that direct evidence is required in order to be certain about what happened in a given situation. But what about cases that have no direct evidence connecting the suspect to the crime scene? Can the truth be proved beyond a reasonable doubt when all the evidence we have is circumstantial? Absolutely. And since the only example we've been shown to this point of circumstantial evidence is witness testimony, we're nudged toward the conclusion that you can build a strong case with only indirect witness testimony as evidence, which is exactly the conclusion we need to reach if we're to accept that Jesus was the Son of God who died on the cross and was resurrected 3 days later." It's pretty slick what Wallace has done here. Next, Wallace dives into a lengthy illustration of the cumulative nature of circumstantial evidence. He describes the hypothetical case of Ron Jacobson, suspected of beating a woman to death with a baseball bat. Ron Jacobson. Where do you think he got that name? Was that like his high school baseball coach who made him ride the bench the entire season? His mom's second husband? I assume it's not the name of an actual murder suspect he investigated, but it sounds like a real name, doesn't it? It doesn't sound like a goofy made-up name, like Benedict Cumberbatch or Thomas Middleditch. Anyway, the case against Ron Jacobson is circumstantial. He fits the description of the killer given by a witness, but he hasn't been positively identified. His alibi turns out to be a lie. He had been romantically involved with the victim, and their breakup was evidently not a happy one. When interviewed by police, he seemed nervous and evasive. There were no signs of forced entry at the victim's residence where the crime was committed, and Ron was found to have a key to the victim's residence, so he wouldn't have needed to force entry to get in there. Detectives also learned from a friend of Ron's that Ron was contemplating suicide the day after the murder. While executing a search warrant on Ron's house, they find a dented baseball bat, which looks consistent with what they think the murder weapon was, and a pair of jeans. And both the jeans and the bat test negative for blood residue, but they both show signs of having recently been cleaned. A pair of boots found at Ron's place matched the description of the killer's boots given by the witness, and these are not just any boots, they are distinctive, they are relatively rare in this area, and in fact only 2 stores in the area where the crime was committed even carry these boots. But wait, there's more. Ron's car matches the witness's description of the killer's getaway car, and like the boots, the car is relatively rare and distinctive. In fact, Ron owns the only such car registered in the entire state. Quote, "Is Ron the killer? Given all that we know about the crime, the only reasonable conclusion is that Ron is the man who committed the murder. Is it possible that Ron is just unlucky enough to suffer from an unfortunate alignment of coincidences that make him appear to be guilty when he is not? Yes, anything is possible. But is it reasonable? No. Everything points to Ron. And when the evidence is considered cumulatively, Ron's guilt is the only reasonable conclusion, while there may be other explanations for these individual pieces of evidence. They are not reasonable when considered as a whole. Remember that as a juror, you are being asked to return a verdict that is based on what's reasonable, not what's possible." As I said in the previous video, this stuff is actually very interesting to me. Wallace is speaking from personal experience here. He obviously has expertise in this area, and he does a very good job explaining and illustrating how a circumstantial case can be compelling, how pieces of indirect evidence, any one of which would be insufficient to prove guilt, can build to a convincing conclusion of guilt when considered collectively. Reading this section reminded me of one of my favorite films, 12 Angry Men, which was about how a jury that is initially convinced of the guilt of a suspect comes to have a reasonable doubt about what was initially a very strong case, based mostly on circumstantial evidence. The hero of that film is the juror who introduces that reasonable doubt and challenges each piece of evidence. But last year I read a piece about that film that made a point similar to the one that Wallace makes in that quote I just read. Even if we can be made to doubt individual pieces of circumstantial evidence on their own, how likely is it that our suspect is innocent, yet so unfortunate to have this much circumstantial evidence pointing toward his guilt? I think that's a really excellent point. Ultimately, the strength of a circumstantial case rests not just on the amount of evidence, but on how we interpret that evidence, because not every piece of evidence points in a single, easily identifiable direction. And that's where Wallace runs into trouble as the chapter goes on, because he now moves from the case against Ron Jacobson to the case for God as the creator of the universe. Quote, "We typically think of God as an eternal, all-powerful being who exists outside of space, time, and matter. The evidence of the finite universe, a universe that has a beginning, points circumstantially to the existence of such a God. An incredibly powerful, uncaused first cause outside of space, time, and matter appears to be necessary to bring our universe into existence." Somebody's been reading their William Lane Craig. Boy, have they. Wait till we get a little further into the chapter. So let's look at the beginning of the universe as a piece of circumstantial evidence. What can we really infer from the mere fact that the universe had a beginning? As far as I can tell, we can't infer anything specific from that, especially about the nature of the cause or the existence or non-existence of a being that is responsible for the cause of the beginning of the universe. The fact that the universe had a beginning doesn't imply anything about what caused that beginning. The fact that we have a finite, temporal, material universe does not imply that whatever caused it to exist must be infinite, timeless, and immaterial. I know there's a nice symmetry to that reasoning, but it doesn't follow at all. Wallace says that we typically think of God as such a being, but that is completely irrelevant. I don't think we can even say that a finite, temporal, material universe supports the notion of an infinite, timeless, immaterial God. Considered outside of any particular religious or philosophical context, I don't see any connection between those two concepts at all. Cosmologists have discovered a few things about the beginning of the universe, or at least about conditions immediately after the beginning of the universe. We know, or at least we think we know, or have a good reason to think that we know, how long ago the Big Bang was, roughly, how quickly the universe expanded following the Big Bang, what the temperature of the universe was, what forms of matter existed, how long it took for recognizable objects from our present universe, like stars and galaxies, etc., to form. But none of those things can be inferred from the simple fact that the universe began to exist, nor can we infer anything about anything that may have happened before the Big Bang from the simple fact that the universe had a beginning. The universe having a beginning is not circumstantial evidence for the existence of Wallace's God or any other God. The only thing the universe having a beginning tells us is that the universe had a beginning. Also, Wallace says that God is typically thought of as an eternal, all-powerful, and transcendent being, and that's true among followers of the Abrahamic faiths today, but it wasn't always the case. There is reason to believe that the specific God described in the Old Testament, Yahweh, was once thought of as more of a local deity who was gradually promoted, so to speak, to creator of the universe. Even the God of the Bible is not necessarily the all-powerful being Wallace believes him to be. In fact, the people who may have originated the stories on which the Old Testament is based may not have believed that Yahweh was the all-powerful, omnipotent creator God of the universe. Now, from the cosmological argument, Wallace cues up the next track from William Lane Craig's greatest hits and presents the argument from design. Quote, "Science has also helped us to understand that the universe appears to be remarkably fine-tuned to support the existence of life. If God exists, he is capable of fine-tuning the universe, and he just might have a reason to do so. The Bible, for example, describes God as the maker of heaven and earth, Psalm 115:15, and describes him as the being who designed and created the universe with the earth in mind. The fine-tuning of the universe is another important piece of circumstantial evidence that points to the existence of an intentional, supernatural, powerful, and creative being." Well, firstly, notice how we went from the universe appears to be fine-tuned to the fine-tuning of the universe is an important piece of evidence with no stops in between to establish that the universe doesn't merely appear to be fine-tuned, but actually is fine-tuned. This is typical of the sort of sleight of hand that is essential to apologist arguments. They slide, hopefully unnoticed, from one position to the next without substantiating the move at all. Secondly, notice how Wallace refers to the Bible as a source for understanding God's motive for creating the universe without establishing the Bible as a reliable source. What does it matter what the Bible says about God as the maker of heaven and earth if we have no evidence, no reason to connect the Bible or the God it describes with the actual beginning of the universe? What Wallace is doing here is saying that because his concept, or the concept of God that is shared by many Christians or many religious believers of multiple faiths, because that concept of God can be made to appear to match certain things about the beginning of the universe or certain characteristics of the universe, therefore one is circumstantial evidence of the other, but that makes no sense at all. If somebody finds a car flipped over on the side of the road, flipped completely over on its hood, and I come up and say, you know, Superman is strong enough to flip a car over. In fact, on the cover of his very first comic book, he's picking a car up over his head. I think this is circumstantial evidence that Superman flipped this car over. That's not circumstantial evidence. You can't take something that could be made to fit the conditions of what is, as far as we know, an imaginary thing and say, oh, look, maybe it's not so imaginary. Flipped a car over. That's what Superman does, or could do, if he was having a bad day, or if there were bad guys in the car, or if Zack Snyder directed the movie. Although if Zack Snyder directed the movie, the car would probably be completely flat or blown up and shrapnel would be everywhere and body parts and viscera spread throughout the city. Anyway, a short digression. I couldn't help myself. About the fine-tuning of the universe. I have long believed and have stated in previous videos, including earlier entries in an Atheist Reads series, that people who insist that the universe is fine-tuned to suit our needs are looking through the wrong end of the telescope. They point out the precise arrangement of natural forces, the physical constants that could radically alter the appearance and nature of the universe if their values were even slightly different than what they are. The precariously balanced conditions that allow for the existence of life as we know it on Earth. And they say, see, what are the odds that all this just happened? This can't be a coincidence. Clearly, conditions have been fine-tuned to produce this universe, and more specifically, us. But what does it really mean that the universe has been apparently fine-tuned for us? If we divorce ourselves from the assumption that we're supposed to be here, that we are the intended universe, that the universe was created as it is for some higher purpose, if we divorce ourselves from all of those presumptions, what we have is this. Things exist in the universe which are permitted to exist by the conditions of the universe. And isn't that exactly what we would expect to see? I'm not sure at this point if Wallace accepts evolution, but isn't that what we see on a much smaller scale in ecosystems on Earth? When we see a highly specialized organism that seems well suited to a particular niche within its environment, we don't assume the environment was engineered to fit the needs of the organism. We assume the organism evolved to adapt to the conditions of its environment. I think it's reasonable to view things like planets, stars, and galaxies the same way. The universe isn't fine-tuned for their existence. They are fine-tuned, or at least adapted, to the conditions of the universe. That which exists is that which conditions allow to exist. What else would we expect to find? Next, Wallace presents the argument from irreducible complexity. Biological organisms, as the argument goes, contain systems so intricate, so complex, that it's much more likely they were products of intentional, intelligent design than blind natural processes. Well, this is such well-worn territory that I'll only say two things about it here. First, irreducible complexity is not recognized as a valid concept by the overwhelming majority of evolutionary biologists. There are evolutionary explanations for every proposed example of irreducible complexity that I have ever heard about. The eye, the bacterial flagella, the coagulation process, and so on. Irreducible complexity is not science. It is pseudoscience. It is evidence of nothing. Second, this argument is being made by Wallace within the context of an overall argument for the existence of God. Even if irreducible complexity were shown to be a valid concept, and even if life on Earth were shown to be the product of an intelligent design, how in the world would it be reasonable to infer from that anything about the circumstances of the creation of the universe? Remember, we're talking about life on Earth, one planet orbiting one star out of hundreds of billions of stars, comprising one galaxy out of hundreds of billions of galaxies. Wallace presents this argument as just one line of circumstantial evidence pointing toward the existence of God, but just as with the previous two arguments, there's nothing here that gets us any closer to substantiating the existence of Wallace's God or any other God. To suggest that it's even remotely plausible to leap from life on Earth was intelligently designed to the universe was created by an omnipotent intelligence is ridiculous. And how arrogant to assume that if we were created by an intelligent designer, it must be the same intelligent designer that created the entire universe. What happened to Wallace's careful, unbiased detective skepticism? Next, proving he read some apologetics before deciding to write some of his own, Wallace turns to the moral argument. Quote, "Each and every one of us feels a certain obligation to moral duty. We have an intuitive sense of moral oughtness. We recognize that some things are right and some things are wrong, regardless of culture, time, or location. We understand that it's never morally right to lie, steal, or kill for the mere fun of it. These moral laws are transcendent and objective. Their truth is not a matter of subjective opinion." Not everyone feels an obligation of moral duty, and there is far from universal consensus on what moral duties consist of, but other than that, I'm perfectly okay with that quote. This too is a road that I've walked down many times before. Wallace makes several assertions about morality as though the things he's saying are well established and universally agreed upon. For instance, quote, "All moral laws come from moral lawmakers." Says who? When was that established? He just declares it as though it's self-evidently true, as though morality hasn't been one of the most hotly debated subjects of philosophy and science for thousands of years. Here's the thing. While there are individuals who lack a sense of moral obligation to their fellow creatures, human societies tend to recognize and enforce moral laws. That's fairly consistent throughout human history, so far as we can tell. And this makes sense. It's difficult to imagine a society that condoned lying, theft, and murder surviving for very long. But that doesn't mean that morality is either transcendent or objective. Because societies, like individuals, don't necessarily agree with one another about what constitutes lying, theft, murder, etc. Many communities recognize two sets of moral rules: the rules that govern how they treat each other and the rules that govern how they treat people from outside their community. That double standard is extremely common. In fact, it comes naturally to most of us. In-group bias can be very difficult to overcome and is very, very easy to exploit, as politicians and propagandists have long known. Add to that the fact that not all moral questions are as easily answered as the ones relating to murder, theft, lying, etc. The moral dilemmas many of us face on a daily basis, large and small, can be extremely difficult to resolve. Morality is messy and often uncertain, and it doesn't sound like something transcendent and objective. It sounds like the imperfect, ever-changing product of an imperfect, ever-changing species of social animal, the individuals of which are constantly struggling to find better ways of understanding and relating to each other and themselves. But even if I accepted Wallace's oversimplification of morality, and even if I thought moral principles were objective and existed separately from the moral beings that recognize and practice or subvert them, that doesn't necessitate that I also accept the existence of a moral lawmaker, at least not the conscious, intelligent moral lawmaker Wallace wants me to accept. Suppose moral laws were similar to the laws of physics or chemistry. Just as the laws of physics and chemistry govern, or to put it more accurately, describe how matter and energy behave, perhaps the laws of morality simply describe how moral beings behave. The analogy isn't perfect because the laws of physics and chemistry are obeyed without exception, so far as we can tell, while any moral laws that exist are apparently not so rigidly enforced. The laws of physics tell how things are, the laws of morality tell how things ought to be. It's not a perfect comparison, But the point is, just as the laws of physics exist without there needing to be a great cosmic physicist to define them, so too could the laws of morality exist without there being a divine moralist imposing them on all of us. They could simply be another naturally occurring characteristic of our existence. Wallace has difficulty with morality within a naturalistic context, however. For a start, quote, "If we live in a purely natural physical world governed by the cause and effect relationships between chemical processes in our brains, free will is an illusion, and the idea of true moral choice is nonsensical. How can I, as a detective, hold a murderer accountable for a series of chemical reactions that occurred in his brain when he didn't have the freedom to escape the causal chain of biological events?" The "if we're all just the result of chemical reactions, nothing matters" argument is bogus for one very simple reason. We don't experience our lives as a series of chemical reactions. Our thoughts and our feelings, our perceptions, are produced by chemical reactions in our brains, but we experience those things as meaningful events. Consciousness, perception, self-awareness, thought, emotion, these things can be reduced to just matter doing stuff. At the most fundamental level, that's what they are, but that doesn't mean that's the only level at which they can possibly have meaning. Even if our choices are ultimately down to chemical reactions over which we have no control, they have meaning because they have meaning to us. And saying that consciousness and choice and experience and our actions in this world as we relate to each other can have no possible meaning because they are ultimately just chemical reactions makes no more sense than saying you cannot appreciate a beautiful painting because ultimately it's just brush strokes and pigment, or you can't appreciate a beautiful piece of architecture, a wonderfully built building, because, well, it's just bricks. Makes no sense. These tiny things accumulate into larger things that have their own cumulative meaning apart from the meaning of the individual components. But that's not Wallace's only problem with naturalistic morality. Quote, "In addition to this, Darwinian evolution cannot produce truly objective morality. If morality is simply a convention of our species, we better hope that science fiction writers are wrong about the possibility of sentient life in other parts of the universe. Unless there is a law above the laws, an entity such as Star Trek's United Federation of Planets would be powerless to stop immoral behavior. Objective morality must be rooted in something bigger than the evolutionary development of any one species." What? The objective or subjective nature of morality has nothing to do with our capacity to act in accordance with our values. This sounds like the argument I've heard other apologists make when they say, well, if morality is relative, then how can you say that female genital mutilation is wrong if it's accepted in another culture? And the answer is because I feel obligated to act according to my values, not according to someone else's values. If I'm walking down the street and I see someone abusing a child, my values tell me that I'm obligated to intervene. If the person beating the child protests that beating children is okay where he comes from, that changes absolutely nothing. I still feel obligated to intervene. Now, that doesn't mean that I should always feel at liberty to impose my values on other people, or that treating my values as innately superior to differing values held by other people is a good idea, as pretty much the entire history of American foreign policy in the Middle East illustrates quite emphatically. It just means that the question of whether or not a given thing is really right or wrong is irrelevant. To use Wallace's Star Trek metaphor, because seriously, how am I going to pass that one up? The Federation would not be powerless to stop what it considered to be immoral behavior, because the Federation is constituted according to a code of conduct that governs its behavior and determines in which situations it intervenes and in which situations it abstains from intervening. In other words, it acts according to its values. Whether morality is objective and transcendent or subjective and variable from group to group makes no difference. We act relative to our values, not someone else's. Our values are what motivate us and what empower us, not some free-floating, pre-existing objective morality. One more quote from this chapter. Quote, "The cumulative circumstantial case for God's existence is much like the circumstantial case we made in our murder investigation. At some point we recognized that the evidence made Ron's guilt in the matter the only reasonable inference, and we got there without a single piece of direct evidence. In a similar way, the circumstantial evidence in our universe is consistent with God's existence and involvement as the uncaused first cause, the fine-tuner, the designer, and the moral lawgiver required to account for all the evidence we observe. As in the homicide investigation, the more evidence we gather, the more reasonable our conclusion becomes." The circumstantial case for God's existence and the circumstantial case for Ron's guilt do have one thing in common. They are both completely imaginary. Beyond that, I don't see the similarities. The evidence for Ron's guilt would be persuasive if this were an actual case, if it actually existed. It fits the definition of circumstantial evidence. But as I explained, even if we grant Wallace his points, that the universe has a beginning, that the universe is fine-tuned, that life on Earth is irreducibly complex, and that morality is objective and transcendent, even if we agree that all of those things are true, and one of them is, by the way, none of it points to God. Not the God Wallace believes in, not any God. The conclusion, God did it, does not follow from any of those individual premises or from the accumulation of all of those premises. It simply doesn't follow. The tip to add to our detective checklist, by the way, was to learn to appreciate circumstantial evidence. And that's a good tip, and one Wallace should follow a bit more faithfully himself when examining religious claims, rather than distorting the concept of circumstantial evidence, as he explained it himself, to make it seem to apply to the lazy regurgitation of William Lane Craig talking points, of which this chapter has consisted, I should say. Now, moving on to chapter 4, which is titled Principle Number 4, Test Your Witnesses. Wallace begins this chapter with an anecdote from a criminal trial. The case hinged on the testimony of the man who had been assaulted and robbed, allegedly by the defendant. The prosecution's case, which hinged on this witness's testimony, was threatened when the defense pointed out that the victim's glasses had been knocked off his face during the assault, making it difficult for him to clearly see his assailant. I'm getting another 12 Angry Men flashback. Luckily for the prosecution, the witness had gotten a good look at his attacker before his glasses had been knocked off, and he was able to confidently identify the defendant in court as the one who attacked and robbed him, and the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Quote, "They believed his testimony, and the rest was easy. Once you come to trust an eyewitness, you eventually must come to terms with the testimony that eyewitness has offered." I agree. But remember, Wallace always makes sense until he starts talking about the Jesus stuff. So let's just wait. So how should we evaluate the trustworthiness of a witness? Wallace presents a list of factors that a judge might ask a jury to consider. For instance, was the witness in a good position to perceive the events in question? Could the witness well remember and describe the events that happened? Did the witness answer questions directly? Was there any prejudice or personal bias evident that could have influenced the witness's testimony? Did the witness's present testimony contradict something they said in the past? How reasonable did the witness's testimony seem given the other evidence presented in the case? But despite all of those many factors considered, the four most important factors to determining whether or not a witness should be relied upon are: was the witness present for the events about which they are testifying? Does the witness have a history of being honest and accurate? Is the witness's testimony verified by other evidence in the case? And does the witness have any motive to lie? Even reliable witnesses can disagree when testifying about the same events, Wallace concedes. But that doesn't necessarily discredit their testimonies. Multiple witnesses can offer differing, even apparently contradictory accounts of the same events, depending on their individual perspectives. But multiple independent accounts are usually preferable to hearing the same unified, harmonized version from all of the witnesses. Or, as Wallace says, quote, I would far rather have 3 messy, apparently contradictory versions of the event than one harmonized version that has eliminated some important detail. I know in the end I'll be able to determine the truth of the matter by examining all 3 stories. The apparent contradictions are usually easy to explain once I learn something about the witnesses and their perspectives, both visually and personally, at the time of the crime. Now I'm getting like a Rashomon flashback. Again, sounds reasonable now. It doesn't mean that it will still be reasonable when we start evaluating the testimony found in the Gospels. So let's just get right to that, shall we? Wallace begins his evaluations of the Gospel writers as witnesses like this, quote, growing up as a skeptic, I never thought of the biblical narrative as an eyewitness account. Instead, I saw it as something more akin to religious mythology, a series of stories designed to make a point. But when I read through the Gospels and then the letters that followed them, it appeared clear that the writers of Scripture identified themselves as eyewitnesses and viewed their writings as testimony. Oh, well, as long as the writers identified themselves as eyewitnesses, I guess it all makes sense. You know, Elvis is alive, by the way. And I know this because I saw him buying a pepperoni pizza sub at Sheets on Sharpsburg Pike in Hagerstown about 2 weeks ago. I'm identifying myself as an eyewitness, and I am saying that you should treat what I'm telling you right now as testimony. I was present at the Sheets when Elvis bought the sub. I have a history of being accurate and honest. Lots of other people have come forward to say they've seen Elvis alive after his supposed death over the years, so my testimony is corroborated by other evidence, and I have no reason to lie about this. There's no particular reason why I should want Elvis to be alive. If he wasn't, I'm not even that big of a fan of Elvis. Oh, also, he got a side order of sweet potato fries and a 32-ounce fountain Coke, and he paid for it with 2 $10 bills. Now, why would I have made up those details? Wallace says that while he heard a lot from Christians before he converted about the infallibility of the Bible, it wound up being much more important to him to study the reliability of the Bible. That's what he focused on when he began to examine the Gospels. And, quote, if it was God's desire to provide us with an accurate and reliable account of the life of Jesus, an account we could trust and recognize as consistent with other forms of eyewitness testimony, God surely accomplished it with the 4 gospel accounts. A, how do you know? What additional evidence is there to corroborate what the Gospels say, particularly the details that require the most extraordinary evidence to corroborate miracles, resurrection, etc.? Is there any? Because I've never heard of any, and I've never heard or read an apologist talk about any. Most attempts at presenting corroborating evidence of the Gospels from outside the Bible are limited to pointing out shit from history that doesn't flat out contradict what the Gospels say. For instance, the towns where the stories take place actually existed, or Pontius Pilate and Herod were actual historical figures. It doesn't actually prove anything significant about the definitive claims of the Gospels, but it doesn't contradict it either, so I guess that's supposed to be good enough. B, the Gospels are not eyewitness testimony at all. Nor would they ever be acceptable as such in any modern court of law, and even if they were, any opposing attorney worth his or her law degree could tear them to shreds. All 4 Gospels and the book of Acts are anonymously authored. Not only are they anonymously authored, they are falsely attributed. Whoever actually wrote them, it was almost certainly not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Oh, and by the way, Paul probably didn't write half the epistles attributed to him either. The Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses. nor were they written by people who were using eyewitness testimony as their primary sources. The fact that the texts themselves identify their authors or several of the people they depict as having been eyewitnesses to the events doesn't make it true. But again, even if it were true, even if the Gospels were eyewitness testimony, that doesn't mean they should be considered reliable eyewitness testimony. Not only do they contain accounts of unbelievable events such as miracles and angelic visitations, they refer to historical events that never happened, like the made-up census that sent Joseph and Mary back to Joseph's ancestral home, or the earthquake and darkness that supposedly followed Jesus' death on the cross. No historical record of any of that. And they include details that no eyewitness could have seen firsthand, like the account of Jesus' 40 days alone in the desert. And even if we assume the Gospels were written by the apostles of Jesus, or at least based on their testimony, we have no independent source of information about the apostles, only what we find written in the New Testament and recorded in church traditions. The Bible is not reliable, convincing evidence, no matter how hard Wallace pretends otherwise. Wallace says that not all eyewitness accounts should be treated equally, and that the memories of unique, powerful experiences tend to be clearer and more reliable than memories of ordinary commonplace events. Quote, "The apostles experienced only one Jesus in their lifetime. They observed only one man rise from the dead. The resurrection was unique, unrepeated, and powerful. The gospel eyewitnesses observed a singularly powerful and memorable event and provided us with accounts that are distinctive, idiosyncratic, personal, and reliable." Again, do you notice the trick that Wallace is pulling here? He's using the amazing events in the life of Jesus as evidence that the apostles or whoever authored the Gospels must have been remembering them accurately. He says only one person ever rose from the dead that they saw. He's assuming the truth of the events and then using the assumed truth of those events to substantiate the testimony, which is the only source for the events. It's a circular argument. By the way, that time I saw Elvis buying a pepperoni pizza sub at Sheetz, only time I've ever seen that. Ever. Never seen Elvis or any other dead celebrity buying a sandwich at my favorite gas station / convenience store / fast food chain. Never happened before, hasn't happened since. Just Elvis, not John Lennon, not Tupac. Though there was one time that I thought I saw Jim Morrison buying a cup of coffee and a breakfast schmuffin, but now that I think about it, it was probably just an old guy with great hair. Where was I? Oh yeah. The tip for our checklist this chapter is, remember that eyewitness testimony can be reliable in spite of apparent contradictions. Even things that contradict the laws of nature, like he turned water into wine, or all the dead people got out of their graves and walked around town and everybody saw them, or God made the lady pregnant, apparently. Even those kinds of contradictions aren't necessarily discrediting to testimony. Well, that's it for this chapter. That's it for this video. In the next video in this series, I will cover the next 2 chapters in the book. Chapter 5, which is principle number 5, hang on every word. And chapter 6, principle number 6, separate artifacts from evidence. That one should be of particular interest, given the various techniques, the various slides that Wallace has attempted in these 2 chapters to make what is not evidence appear to be evidence. So that's it for this video, everybody. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment. Tell me what you thought. Agree, disagree, be you atheist, Christian, or any other category of person. If you like this video, please like it, please share it, please subscribe to this channel if you're not subscribed already, and also please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron. The next Patreon milestone is audio-only, high-quality podcasts of the An Atheist Reads series, going all the way back to the first series of An Atheist Reads the Case for Christ, working my way up to the present situation. Brand new, high-quality audio recordings that you can listen to on the go of the entire An Atheist Reads series. That's the next goal in the Patreon milestone, patreon.com/Steve Shives. A small monthly donation, you can help make it happen. Thank you all so much for your support and for watching, and I will see you next time.